Let's see if I can navigate this really quickly. We get to see it one more time. There's Mayra. So I am thrilled to welcome back alumna Myra Granados and Allyson Drayton, who are going to be sharing with us over the next 20 to 25 minutes. If you have questions for them, please send them via the chat or the Q&A function. We'll hopefully have a couple minutes at the end. But when we were thinking and considering our spheres of impact and voices, experiences, and needs that we want to uplift, we are so grateful that you accepted the invitation to join us here at the SHAPE conference here today. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you and welcome you to share your screen.
Okay, thanks, Emily. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, I hope everyone can see that. All right, so my name is Allyson Drayton, and I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm also a Black woman who carries this identity with her at all times. I am passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and improving quality and access to care for BIPOC people. So I've been in the helping profession since 2006 in both direct care and program administration. I've been practicing therapy for 6 of those years. So for Myra and I, as women of color who have achieved advanced degrees, we have had to balance our own values and sense of self while trying to survive and thrive in environments that were not made with us in mind. So the result for me was a struggle. Sometimes that was academically, sometimes professionally, and often emotionally because of adverse events and because I had to develop a new identity just to move more comfortably in those spaces. So as students and higher education professionals, it is critical that we not only understand, but we act in order to support each other and ourselves. So Akankia spoke about being unapologetically her. That is what we want to touch on today. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my co-facilitator, Myra, for her introduction.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mayra. As Emily said, I am an alumni of CSU. I identify as a Latina, Mexicana woman. I am also a licensed professional counselor working within community mental health. I've been in the field for about 5 years now. When I originally started, I did some work in youth corrections and then also in a community clinic. So a little bit all over the place, but for the most part, most of the work that I've done is always being a part of a team where really the highlight is the services we provide to Latino and Spanish-speaking communities. As I share my story with you on the screen here, I want to read out this quote by Gloria Ansaldúa. She is the author of the book Borderlands, La Frontera. So borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is a constant state of transition, and the prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. And the reason why I chose this quote to highlight my own experience with microaggressions and reaction formation and tone policing was because that's been basically my life. Constantly, my identities are in this constant state of transition. I interact with my identities in a different way depending on the setting that I'm in. As you see in these pictures here, I'm an immigrant, a first generation immigrant to the US. I was born in Mexico in Los Reyes, Michoacan. And I grew up in a single parent home. So that definitely was like the start of how my life was shaped. I am an alumni of CSU, and I remember the numerous naps I got to take at El Centro, and remembering our assistant director at the time who would come out and play the guitar in the mañanitas every birthday for the students that hung out in that space. I received my master's at Regis University, where I wanted to really go into a field where I was going to help others, but also minimize the stigma within my own community when it comes to mental health and what it is for us to seek those services. And really, this was the first time that I think I really experienced some imposter syndrome. For me, being a clinician has meant that most of the time my story relates more to that of my clients, even when I'm working in youth corrections, than it really does to my colleagues. And especially as a first generation student and somebody with an advanced degree, or the only person with an advanced degree in my family.
All right. So thanks so much for sharing that, Myra. I wanted to go a little bit into my own experience of being in grad school. So Myra and I actually went to grad school together. We both went to Regis. So I wanted to start my slide with this quote by Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde, she was many things. She was a writer, she was a librarian, and she was a civil rights activist. So I almost wanted to preface this slide with something that's like, beware Black anger. So the quote goes, "My response to racism is anger. I have lived with that anger, ignoring it, feeding upon it, learning to use it before it laid my visions to waste for most of my life. Once I did it in silence, afraid of the weight. My fear of anger taught me nothing, and your fear of that anger will teach you nothing also." So when I was in grad school, and even before that, I decided that it would be easiest to save time if I wore my hair in twists. I love the options that it gave me, and it's cute. I mean, I was able to dye my hair without dyeing my hair, and I didn't have to do much in the mornings to get ready. So I have never gotten used to other people's curiosity about my hair. I'm a New Yorker, and New Yorkers have pretty big bubbles. So we really didn't enter into each other's spaces unless we knew that it was safe. But ever since I left New York, the curiosity around my hair just grew and grew and grew. And I will never get used to someone violating my space by taking it upon themselves to touch my hair. However, I had no tools to deal with it. And back then, and still now, there was very little protection or care around this issue. It was only last year when we passed the Crown Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against somebody based on their hair. So when I sucked it up, I basically learned to just deal with it, to not have a reaction, to not have a response. And in response, I hated my anger. I hated a feeling that came naturally to me. And eventually I would hate myself for letting other people get away with it. So when I took a practice exam with my peers in grad school, a colleague approached me. Basically, she stood over me because I was sitting and she was standing, and that's a whole nother dynamic. She grabbed a handful of my locks and held it up to her face for inspection. She asked, "Are these dreads?" Completely oblivious to my discomfort and completely oblivious to my anger. My urge is to confront. Again, I'm a New Yorker, and I can be pretty direct. So I could not express my anger in that environment. At least I did not feel that my emotional response was justified. And I was honestly scared of being labeled an angry Black woman. So I sucked it down, and my dignity went with it. So we're going to talk about a couple of definitions throughout this discussion, as well as in our workshop following this. So we wanted to start by kind of explaining some of those terms to you.
So a term that you'll hear us use a lot today is microaggressions. And there's really 3 different types of microaggressions. The first one being micro assaults, so conscious and intentional actions. This can be something like displaying a swastika or deliberately serving a white client before or customer before a Black customer. Micro insults, these are more verbal or nonverbal communications that are a little bit more subtle, but they convey this rudeness or insensitivity to someone with a marginalized identity. Micro invalidations can be communications that exclude or negate the thoughts, feelings, or experiences of people of color and those with marginalized identities. Tone policing is a type of microaggression and also a silencing tactic. This is something that really dismisses the ideas that are being communicated when they are perceived to be delivered in an angry, frustrated, sad, or otherwise emotionally charged manner. It is very effective because it really allows the person to critique the emotional level of the message that's being delivered rather than the message itself. And reaction formation. This is a psychological term speaking to how we can sometimes respond to things in the opposite way of how we actually feel. A lot of times we do this mainly out of fear, fear of rejection, or if we sense a threat to our survival.
So next is imposter syndrome. And I'm sure that there's nobody watching today that can relate to this experience. So imposter syndrome is primarily when someone who's objectively making achievements, they're getting good grades, they have, a circle of friends that they engage with. They maybe are speaking at a keynote, or they're doing other things that are getting attention and that are rewarding to them, but they're not attributing that success and those achievements to themselves. They are attributing those achievements to something external, so something outside of themselves. This is a factor that heavily influences the development of burnout, and it's something that BIPOC individuals are disproportionately affected by. So next we have burnout. So burnout is just emotional, mental, and our physical exhaustion, where we are under a high amount of stress or a high level of overwhelm for a long period of time. We are just not built, our nervous systems are not built to live in that type of space for a very long time. And eventually it catches up to us and we lose joy and we lose motivation for things that before maybe we were very passionate about. And so finally, vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is something that's generally associated with the cost of caring for other people. So long story short, trauma is catching. You can even relate trauma to a virus. If you are exposed to students or friends or family members or peers or employees that have been traumatized, maybe lived through a pandemic, civil riots and injustice and all of those things, you can then catch that from them. So dealing with those individuals can be traumatizing in itself. So it may come up as you're working with and advocating for students, as well as if you're supervising a staff that you may or may not agree with. So next, we're gonna go ahead and give a couple of stats. So, because some of those definite, and they're actually more common than you think.
The first one being that 80% of college students reported feeling overwhelmed by all of the things that they have to do. As an institution, it is easy to perceive that as a college student, really the only focus is academics. And so it can be easy to negate the diverse struggles that affects our students. These struggles can affect their academic success and a lot of times reinforce that imposter syndrome, reaction formation, and inauthenticity. First generation students especially experience high rates of imposter syndrome and perfectionism. They also deal with a lot more academic probation and low retention rates than their counterparts.
So the next stat is that 40% of students felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. This means that it was difficult to get out of bed, difficult to put on your favorite pair of sweats, difficult to brush your teeth or take a shower. This is huge. And so college students, what we also found from the data that held this information was that students reported a history of suicidal ideation, self-harm, and attempted suicide. However, they were not treated or diagnosed at the same rates. So another thing that comes up is that students may report anonymously, or as we'll talk about later, they'll go to different resources or areas for support. However, they're less likely to be open about struggles, especially if they're already marginalized or they belong to a group that stigmatizes mental health. So students and really most of the population carry a trauma suitcase. This is often invisible and it presents itself in ways that educators and employers and peers either don't recognize or attribute to another cause. So in higher education, we often shove psychosocial issues off to those engaged at the student center. That's their area of expertise, we would say.
So as professionals, we can acknowledge that this happens to both students and staff, right? The mental health statistics that we shared, staff become just as overwhelmed. And sometimes what this can cause is this idea of a reaction formation and almost representing yourself inauthentically in order to navigate that space.
Right. So imagine that you have to limit the emotions that you express or that you feel for the sake of being accepted, being maintaining stability, not needing to rock the boat at work, for example, or in your environment, having to be composed, for the sake of keeping a safe space. And this is typically for other people, not necessarily for us who's having those feelings. So as a result, feeling disappointed or uncomfortable due to not being able to do more, or do something differently. In effect, we're really policing our own emotions and reactions to things that are happening to us and that's happening around us. So Myra, I know you have an example about how this has come up for you.
So for myself, my first position right out of grad school was working in youth corrections. I was the only clinician of color and a team of 11 clinicians, and was really trying to make an impression, really, right? I was brand new to the field and wanted to show my teammates that I knew what I was doing. Unfortunately, when working in that environment, there was times where I would hear, our Black and brown youth being talked about, where their behaviors were really being attributed to personality traits or some piece of their background. And at the same time, those same behaviors were being identified and justified as mental health symptoms for some of our white youth. And so just being in that environment and not knowing when to speak up and feeling like if I didn't, for my clients who are the majority are Latino, Spanish speaking students and our Black students, feeling like a sellout, right? Because I wasn't doing enough to stand up for them and fight for a better way of treating them.
Yeah. So, I can definitely relate to feeling out of place and feeling like you can't express yourself fully or adequately. So I'm pretty comfortable with expressing my opinions directly. However, it wasn't always that way. And I still, to this day, communicate in an unnatural way because of these experiences. So when I worked in a healthcare setting, I expressed concerns around a threat to staff work-life balance as our caseloads were ready to increase from 80 clients each to almost 18,000 people with the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, and Medicaid expansion. So though I worded my email objectively and concisely, the only response I got was directed to my perceived tone and attitude, and my supervisor expressing in front of an entire team that I needed to learn better email etiquette. I wish I can say that that was the first or even the last time that that happened. But because my livelihood suddenly became threatened, from that time forward, I included smiley faces and exclamation marks and many LOLs. So I never received any negative feedback about etiquette when I began using emojis and shorthand in professional emails. So I began to feel really cynical. So there's a cost to, acting different than who we feel we are. So other costs.
So for some folks who are having to act inauthentically, they are more likely to engage in unethical behavior.
They're more likely to see other people as dishonest.
Or more likely to see others as unethical as well.
And to have general feelings of inauthenticity, which we mentioned relates to burnout and overall feelings of overwhelm. And so while this is common for all of us, marginalized groups experience this at a higher rate due to implicit bias, systemic inequity, and white supremacist elements. So if Myra or I came to one of you and with one of these situations that we brought up today, what would you do? Maybe you might feel helpless because you can't change the world. You can't change actions or things that have already happened. So what can you do when there's not much to do?
One of those things that you can do is validate. So validation is really important, especially when you're in a role, as we think about the student center and students that are coming in for the first time into this unknown space. Just remembering that all of their feelings and experiences are valid, regardless of whether or not you agree or identify, and also regardless of your opinion.
And so what you can also do is exhibit some empathy, be empathetic. So there's a difference between empathy and sympathy, right? So empathy is when you're really imagining a time when you felt similarly, and you don't have to be a member of that group or share the same experience to empathize with somebody. You actually are looking into your own stuff. So Brene Brown, we all love Brene Brown. She really does a great job with differentiating between sympathy and empathy, and also defining empathy. Empathy means that we are getting down in the dirt. So we are going into our own stuff and saying, hey, yeah, I can relate to a time when I felt out of place. I may not be able to relate to being a part of this group, but I can relate to this feeling. Likewise, I can relate to feeling angry or feeling like I'm not being my true self. So you're actually getting into your own junk, relating to something that might be deep down or dirty or nasty or something that you don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, but you will, right? So that you can be there and walk with the person who's coming to you.
And then finally, dignity. So conducting yourself in a way that demonstrates not just respect for others, but also respect for yourself. Demonstrating an appreciation for the authenticity and seriousness of the occasion and the situation being presented, even if you don't fully understand it. Being open to learning more while holding that same respect.
Absolutely. So it's something that we all have a right to. And when we start there, we can go very far. So of course, this is just a brief overview. There's so many things because this is such a complicated issue. We hope that you join us for our workshop where we'll discuss a little bit more of this further. So we really appreciated you guys inviting us today, and we'd love to connect if you have any questions or if anything came up really spoke to you. So here is our email and Instagram, and thank you so much for having us.
I feel like I should also have like the applause in the background. Oh my gosh, Allyson, Myra, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us. I'm going to ask you to stay on screen for just a moment as a shout out. I know that maybe for some it might have been a little small on the screen. Melanated Health, Mental Health Connection is the Instagram handle that you can follow. We have these fantastic experts with us. So if we have time for a question or two. If someone wants to come, we can invite you on. We can give you access to speak or put into the Q&A. So we'll give just a little while to see if folks have questions. I have to say that as folks are generating those, and maybe they'll bring them into your workshop, I found myself really appreciative for the ways that you shared your personal experiences, and knowing that our students are going through many of those, and that while we all are dealing with different stressors and stressful information and might be experiencing burnout, the reality for folks within different marginalized communities needs to be understood and recognized, especially within the student center. So thank you for bringing it back to our employees in the student centers and what we can do every day. Really, really grateful. We have a number of thanks coming through on the chat. We do have a question that I would love. Oh my gosh, there's so much gratitude coming in for you that I wish I could read out to all. I'm going to find the question. Would you mind explaining more about the distinction between empathy and sympathy? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, great question. So I can speak to this a little bit more, and then Myra, feel free to jump in and add anything. So sympathy and empathy, it can be easily misunderstood, or we might say that feel like it's the same. So when we talk about sympathy, sympathy really creates or maintains a space, right, between you and the person who's expressing an issue or a concern or a feeling. So here, the way that I like the way that Brene Brown explains it, because it's, you imagine somebody who's down in a deep hole and they're looking for a way up, and you're up top and you're like, man, I see you. That really sucks. You know, so it's more, it's not unhelpful. Sympathy can be very important, and it is very important, but it doesn't allow ourselves to make that emotional connection to what that person is experiencing. Whereas with empathy, if you have, and this is where, you know, it gets very uncomfortable. So for example, maybe somebody lost a friend. So that same person down in the hole is like down there and they're sad and they're like, you know, nobody wants to be friends with me. And, you know, I'm really sad about the fact that nobody wants to be friends with me. And instead of saying, yeah, man, it really sucks to not have any friends, you're climbing down the ladder and you're digging in and thinking of a time when maybe you have felt lonely, or maybe you have felt alienated. And that can bring up really uncomfortable feelings, and we're using that to be vulnerable and create an intimate moment with the other person, so that the person could say, I'm not alone in this, and I'm not the only person going through this. So it really creates more of an intimate connection where the person can feel what you're feeling and feel like they have somebody going through it with them.
Allyson, thank you so much. We have two more questions and probably time for one answer. So maybe you can choose which one you want to answer and then take the other one to the workshop. So
and I know one of the questions. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go
I
ahead,
was gonna
Mayra.
say, I know one of the questions was around emotional intelligence and being your authentic self. We are going to explore that a lot more in the workshop, so maybe that's one that we can answer there. And then Connor, if you're not in that workshop, we can definitely send that handout. And then the other one was, what is a good way to create inclusivity for student employees from marginalized communities? I don't know if that's necessarily like a black or white answer, right? I think there's a lot of gray space and a lot of, it's really individualized. Similar to this idea of like in a classroom, right? Where there's like the one brown person and it's the multicultural day, right? Like we can't have an expectation that that one student is going to speak for the whole Latino community, right? So just allowing a space for their voice and their ideas while also not automatically making that an expectation that they're going to know everything and they're going to speak for, you know, we're now going to tokenize them, right? So making that a flexible experience while also showing that empathy and validating.
That's great. Thank you so much to the both of you. I know that we will start our workshops pretty soon, so feel free to head off into your Zoom rooms. I will invite folks to, for specifically the facilitators or Zoom room hosts, you can leave now and go open your rooms. For those of you who are attending, I have some information for us that we'll go over. But please, wherever you are, give some applause to our fantastic keynote speakers. Myra, Allyson, thank you so much.